Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby. I'm joined today by my good friend, Jordan Hutchison. Jordan is the Director of Partnerships at XYPN, and he is an expert in behavioral science and a doctoral candidate in the very same. So we're going to talk today about motivation, about human nature, about decision-making, and the exciting world of flow research. So welcome to the show, Jordan.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, I must also say Jordan is a wonderful house guest. Jordan lived with us for about a month when he moved here from Alabama to Atlanta, and there's not many people I'd let live in my house for a month, but you were a great house guest. So welcome to the show, my favorite house guest.
I appreciate you letting me stay, and it was definitely nice to have the one person I knew in Atlanta let me stay with him while I was here. So.
Yes,
nice.
Well, you've done big things since you arrived in the city, and we'll talk about some of those today. I want to start by talking about some of your research. You're a doctoral candidate in behavioral science. I want to talk about your research you're doing into flow and flow states, but that's going to be a term of art that is lost on some people. Some of the listeners won't be familiar with that. So, for those who are unaware, what is flow in the first place?
So I'll give the academic definition just so that all of the listeners that have PhDs like yourself will say that I have a little credibility to me. So it's the optimal experience that is a state of deep absorption in an activity that is intrinsically motivating with defined goals and is enjoyable. And so what does all that mean? And so the way that I best explain it is being in the zone. So when you're doing a task or an activity that has those clear goals and you're getting that direct feedback and you're in that zone where you lose track of time and you just feel like you're accomplishing so much or doing so well if it's like a leisure activity.
Yeah. So, athletes talk about being in the zone, maybe less of being in a flow state. But, I've heard Albert Pujols talk about, the ball being as big as a beach ball, when you're in that flow state. You talk about Jordan and he's like the hoop. It's like the hoop was 6 feet wide and I couldn't miss. You're a college athlete. Did you ever experience a flow state when you were playing basketball?
I have. And actually like thinking about this conversation, I tried to think back, when was the first time I ever thought, like you hear like, what was your earliest money conversation? Or when did you start being aware of money decisions and things like that? And so I tried to think back, when was the first time I heard about flow or thought about it? And actually, my father is the one that brought it up, not from the academic perspective, but being a college athlete, and he played some pro basketball as well, that he used to tell me as a basketball player growing up when he was teaching me is, clear the mechanism, be in the zone and focus on, and is specifically actually to shooting free throws, is clear all the yelling and get so focused that you don't hear anything and you're in that zone. And so that was where I first experienced it, and definitely continued on as playing sports. I've gone in that state, and that's really one of the roots of why I think it's so impactful, is where I first learned it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was watching an interview with the Olympic 400-meter hurdle gold medalist this morning, and she was talking about, she wasn't calling it flow, but she said, when I run, I hear nothing. She's like, I hear no crowd noises. I hear no external noises. It's just me and my process. So let's talk about how we get there. So the father of flow is a psychologist by the name of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and I'm not even going to try and spell his name, but go look for his book Flow. He had an interview in Wired magazine where he talked about how he defined flow, and he defined it as: the ego falls away, time flies, every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. Your whole being is involved, and you're using your skills to the utmost. Now, that is a beautiful description,
Right.
very nice. But as a social scientist, you can't measure with, did it feel like jazz to you, right?
Right.
So how do you take something as sort of hard to pin down as flow and begin to measure it and study it in a meaningful way?
Right. And what's great is Dr. Mihai, which one of my panelists on my dissertation proposal made a joke that I should get, points just for being able to pronounce it correctly over and over again while I was defending my proposal. But it's unique that he says jazz in this one quote, because literally in my proposal, I used a picture from the new Disney movie Soul, where if anyone's seen that, or it's one of my son's favorite movies, but he actually is playing the piano for a jazz band and he goes into a flow state. And so that's what, when I see that or hear that quote, I love it because it literally fit in perfectly from a proposal. But on the measuring side of it, the ways that I've seen it measured and from my research and how I'm actually measuring. So the way that early started, and Dr. Csikszentmihalyi was a big proponent of, was the ESM, so the experience sampling method, where basically they give you a beeper, or if anyone knows what a beeper still is, but some kind of electronic thing where they can ping you and say, hey, here's this question, rate it from 1 to 6, or something like that. They can ping you throughout the day to get feedback. The other one is retrospective. And so that's actually how I'm doing it currently on financial planners, is just reflecting on their prior weeks. And I'm using a certain measure that's focused just on work instead of the broad spectrum of flow. And then, of course, you have the neuroscience way where, they can hook you up to fMRIs and see what's triggering, what's firing in your brain to get a little bit more of a measure from it. But that one's beyond my scope.
Yeah, perfect. So we started off with a very formal definition of flow, and slowly but surely we're working towards more and more practical applications, right? So we talked with the formal definition, then we talked about its sort of jazz-like element. Now we're going to get to a simple two-part explanation that even two guys from Alabama can grasp. Because if you have to break it down to its core elements, flow is really a state of elevated execution of something at which you find at something at which you are skilled and something that you find pleasurable, right? So this is something that these are sort of the two constituent parts of flow, it seems to me. There's elevated levels of skill and there's enjoyment or pleasure that you find in this. So right. A couple of questions, come out of this for me. The first is, can you find flow state at a job or a task that you hate, right? Let's say you don't love your job. You don't find it all that meaningful. Can you ever really be in the zone doing something you don't like? And then the second question is, let's say you love it. You want to be a skateboarder or something like this. Well, no one right. steps on a board the first time and is good. So how do we get past those early non-flow states and develop a level of expertise when the task is hard to learn?
Right. No, then those are both great questions. And so I'll start with the work one. And so when I think about it at work, the definition that a lot of academics use for the work side of flow is they've shortened the experience. So it's called a short-term peak experience. So it's not as long, whereas when you're doing leisure activities, you can lose track of time and be, some of the early research on the creative space, hours at a time playing an instrument or painting and things like rock climbing. So from the work side of it, the way I look at it is, of course, early in your career, I think you really need to figure out what you're like. What do you want to do? What do you like? A lot of times we all feel like we have to know exactly what our career was and what we need to be doing long term. We've talked about this before, that our careers have both went in very different ways, and who knows, we both grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. And so it all can change. And so I think early on, learning to find where your expertise is and to be like a more application side of it. I think of when a lot of on the engagement world, they talk about managing towards people's strengths. And so we've all heard of those. And so that's something that I always think of with the flow side of it is, those are the things people are really good at, because one of the big constructs of flow is that, like you said, that challenge and skill balance. You have to have that balance to go as a precursor into the flow state. And so finding what you're good at is how you can find yourself in that flow state. If it's a job you hate and you can't find anything you like about it, it might be time to start, perusing LinkedIn and Indeed to maybe find something else, or reaching out to your network, because if you're not engaged in your job, that's a whole different beast. But on the personal side, I would say that I would frame it a little different, whereas flow is not necessarily how the world sees you as this exceptional athlete. And so we're in the time right now of Olympic athletes, and you're just watching people fly through the water. And you're like, if I go swim 25 meters of that 50 meter, I'm exhausted in the middle of that pool, having to find my way to the side because I can't swim that fast or that long without taking a huge gulp of air. But from that personal side, when it's the skill and the challenge balance, you got to think that maybe to you, that challenge is at your level and that skill of that task. Because when you go out to shoot basketball, it might be a little different for me because I'm shooting because I've been playing since I was, old enough to pick up a basketball. But someone that's going to pick up the sport, they might find that flow state with much less of that difficulty of the task. So they'll go in that flow state. And then each time they do that, it actually has to get better to go into the flow state. So it has to get harder. So they're actively becoming better at the sport or activity.
Yeah. So, that gets to the point about learning a new skill. The level of engagement or the level of challenge needed to achieve flow is a bit of a moving target. As your skills improve, the challenge becomes, you got to do more to get that same level of challenge. And that's nice to hear, though, because it means you can experience flow at a relatively low peak of expertise because it's challenging for you relative to your skill set. It's not like you have to wait till you're Tony Hawk, right, to get to get that first moment of flow. So Jordan, the research on flow is like borderline gaudy. Like the stuff that accrues to people who are in a flow state is pretty incredible. We've got greater happiness, better emotional control, increased engagement, outsized creativity. The list really just goes on and on. The literature on flow is pretty incredible. So that's great for artists and athletes. I think we see the natural benefit of those things to creative folks and athletes. But what about the people you're working with? In your day job and in your research, tell us what you're finding as you study flow in financial professionals.
Right. Yeah. And that's one reason why, when you're talking about all the different positive benefits of it, that's one reason why I love the topic so much, is you can't find many things in psychology or in management theory that is ubiquitous across all genders, cultures, all backgrounds. And that's one of the greatest things that I find just so amazing about it, is that they've done research on gamers. They've done research on people from all walks of life and different cultures and different backgrounds. And so I feel like that's so powerful because it's even different ages. And so that's one reason why I love it. But part of the why I look at it on the financial perspective is two parts. So one, for that client experience, in my early time of the behavioral world, I helped create a tool around and the application of a tool to help people through transitions. And so helping them find that tool or that flow experience during a transition in life. And I'll give an example to help give some clarity on it. It helps them move on through that transition and find where they can have fulfillment and happiness. And then, all the spillover effects of flow. And so for one example of that is I had a client in my advisor days that her husband died. And it was extremely unfortunate. We were working through all the numbers side of it and the very technical piece, but she was really missing him. She was wanting to, do more activities. He wasn't around. He was more of the one that pushed her to do things. And so in the conversation of going through this tool, we were able to help her find that she missed knitting. It's something she hadn't done. And it's something that simple. She started to talk about just knitting she would lose herself for hours at a time watching TV or doing, just sitting there knitting. And it brought so much fulfillment. That's so small, but it brought so much like purpose and fulfillment. She was starting to build it for, her grandkids and, make different things for them. So that's one that I really look at. And then another example I'll say is on the executive side. So in a prior role, we worked with some executives, and this marketing person I used to work with, she used to always say in this conversation is that you go from executive to the third person in line at Starbucks. Mm-hmm. So you lose that value or that identity as this big, important person, all those relationships. And so taking them through a flow conversation, they were able to find more things outside of, oh, I'm going to retire and play golf. Okay, but there's got to be more to retirement. It's a lot more to it than that. But that's definitely on that piece. And then I'll say on the advisor side, something just at XY that we spend a lot of time focusing on is how can we have our advisors and our members really focused on doing what they're best at. We talk a lot about niche and really focusing on their niche, being an expert in that, but also what can you, delegate away or outsource so that you can do what you're best at. And that truly is like a casual way of saying, where can you find flow? Because this is what you're good at. This is what's really hard for just the average person to try to step in and do. And so that's why with my research, I'm really focusing on financial planners.
We know that we work in an industry that's evolving rapidly. Parts of the industry are getting commoditized at a very quick rate. So I think advisors are increasingly relying on relational and behavioral things to provide value to their clients, as opposed to just being simple asset managers, say. Would you say that it's an advisor's job, like to help their clients find flow? I mean, is that within sort of the bailiwick of a financial advisor?
I think that it could be, if you're an advisor that wants to change your client experience or to differentiate yourself. There's a lot of great trainings that are starting to come up where they give you tools of different methods. I mean, these tools just as well as I do, but like Kinder's life planning and some of, money quotient. And then there's a Sudden Money Institute, these other programs that give you kind of their lens of how they work in the financial advisory world. I would see flow as a way that if an advisor has, their own client goals format, this is another way to help them through those transitions. Not saying that every single one has to do it, but I do see it as, from my perspective, that it is part of the client going through different life events and transitions that you got to have something to open that conversation and some kind of method or process.
Yeah, I think if you could help someone get there, I feel like they would, I just feel like they would feel so indebted to you, and they'd be so sort of knit to you and so grateful that you were helpful in helping them sort of discover what they do best and what gives them that flow. It seems like something that would certainly increase the bond between a client and an advisor. So one of the things that I think traditionally has been a disservice in the way that we talk about flow is that we use athletics so often as an example that someone listening goes, well, sure, that's nice for the platform divers and the skateboarders and the football players. But I'm just, Joe Sixpack here at home. This may not apply to me. That's why I loved your example of knitting, right? This doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be life-changing. If someone is listening to this and going flow sounds really cool, and I don't think I've ever achieved it, what would you tell them to kind of just get started on this process of working towards achieving that flow state? Because once you've had it, you want it again, it's addictive. Right. So how would you tell them to begin to seek that out?
Yeah, so the most casual way in which I'm a big believer in, actually application instead of going too heavy into the academic language of it or the jargon. But I would say really it's a reflective way. It's looking back and thinking of where do you find fulfillment, or where have you found fulfillment? What activities, leisure, just from the personal side, whenever you're on a vacation or if you have some free time, where do you really find fulfillment and happiness? Is it being with your kids, or is it, doing a certain task or activity with them? Then really focus on that. And that is where you're finding those flow states. And then also on the work side, we've all heard these different like start and stop exercise or delegate and elevate, all these different things like that. Find those things that you really enjoy doing. And that's one reason why I love this research, is because no one, for my knowledge, has studied flow on our financial advisors. I've seen some things where they talk about positive psychology or salespeople going into the flow state when they're pitching or they're up presenting. And so if you can think about where you're really doing your best, people are giving you the feedback that, hey, God, that was an amazing presentation. Maybe that's something you should focus on because you're getting that fulfillment, and try to focus your career almost like job designing, that these are the things you need to focus on. And that's the same with the personal side, is with the spillover of the fulfillment and the happiness, all of those things, you can't stay in a flow state all day long, but being able to focus those things when you have those free times really will add a lot of value and give you that energy in your life outside of it.
Yeah. So that's been a fantastic summary of flow. Another thing that you study and have interest in is the science of motivation. And I find that motivation is a lot more complicated than people commonly understand. Right. I think people have, a very sort of binary, simple idea of how motivation works. Like, oh, pay people more, incentivize them. And I mean, there's many cases in the research where paying people to do something actually disincentivizes them.
Right.
So in your study of motivation, is there anything you've found that's like very sort of contrary to your notion before you started the study? Any sort of surprising findings as you've studied human motivation?
Some of the things is it's almost like financial planning. One of the topics that I always think of is that it's so contextual. It's just like anything in financial planning or just in psychology. There's never that one size fits all kind of thing. And so when it comes to motivation, I feel like there has to be, I'm a big believer in the intrinsic side, because if it's not intrinsically engaging you or motivating you, then it's going to be a much more difficult to get that individual or yourself to do it. But to like talk on some research that you and I have talked about before, is I love like the Fresh Start Effect from Katie Milkman. She just came out with a great book, How to Change. She also talks about temptation bundling and some of these things that we might have already been doing and we weren't as aware of them. And so I love some of those things, because if you can tie an extrinsic piece to it or merge them together to make some kind of, it's all about contextual situation, that some people actually are motivated by money. Some people are more motivated if you give them benefits to take care of their family. They're good. You don't have to pay them as much. Just pay for their childcare or something like that. I think that you have to go into each one with an open mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that book is fantastic. I'm about halfway through, and I've really enjoyed that. Biggest, best read I've taken on in a long time. So this is a time, I think, when the science of motivation has had very high stakes for the last 18 months or so. We've had sort of a mass experiment in human behavior and trying to motivate people to take steps to protect themselves and others, and in fact, more complicated to protect others. Just right. Because of the way that COVID spreads, you could yourself not be all that high risk, but could be a risk of being a vector that could hurt other people. Right. So if the CDC came to you in, let's say, January or February of 2020 and said, Jordan, we want you to help motivate people to try and stay at home for a couple of weeks and wash their hands, right? Like right. How, you and I travel a great deal. It's consistently disappointing to me how few people in an airport bathroom wash their hands. It's like one of the times I'm most disappointed in humanity, when you see people ducking out without washing their hands. You're like, come on, man. Yeah. So you're February 2020, CDC approaches you. You got to motivate people to wash their hands. What do you do? What steps do you take?
Well, my first response would be, yikes. I don't think that I'm going to get paid enough for this. No, it's one of those where I think about, it seems like a lot, because you're holding almost so much. You got to motivate so many different people. But like and there's so many great scientists, that have been doing this right now, and so many great behavioral experts. And I try to read as much, they're throwing everything they can at it to get, all the numbers up of, not numbers up of COVID cases, but numbers up of people taking the vaccine or, all of those things. And so the first thing I think of when I hear that question is I think of like the lottery that I've seen in some states where, because I've seen that work, with savings accounts and things like that. That's what I think of as providing the lottery, where people are more likely to adopt because, their name's put in a lottery to win $1 million, stuff like that. That's one way I've seen it. And another one that comes to mind is I think of those social norm studies with the taxes. Of course, a lot of mine's rooted around money because it's the background. But it's what's unique about it is they did it in one country, and so many, people paying their taxes on time spiked, whereas they did it in a different country and it had no effect. And it's so basically, whereas the United States is so big, you could do it in one state and it's like, oh man, I don't want people to look at me as not paying my taxes earlier on time. But then you go to, probably our home state and people are like, I could care less. I'm going to pay them whatever I want to. So I see something around the social norms. I've seen some cool research on that. And I think that those small nudges, we just have to keep doing different things. Cause like we said before, it's so contextual. Everyone's so different. How can we try to find a way that's intrinsic? If we can't, how can we nudge people, like the small things that, a lot of your listeners have probably heard and you're aware of, is like the changing of music for purchases of alcohol, and the changing of music in subways to lower crime. And I think speaking of airports, the putting the fly in the urinal to lower spillage or whatever. And like another cool one I've seen is where they put keyboard keys on steps to try to get people to use the steps instead of like elevator or escalator. So I think a lot of those we just have to keep deploying. It seems like I wish there was like one answer, but everyone's so different. And I feel like trying to find what intrinsically motivates people is so tough.
Yeah. One of my favorite health studies on a public health crisis and how they motivated people to make good steps happened years ago. It was in Thailand during the spread of HIV/AIDS. And the HIV was spreading in Thailand at like a very dramatic clip. And so the first thing they tried was a scare campaign, right? So they put all these signs up everywhere that said, the dreaded plague is coming, and like, watch out, it's going to get you. And, and what happened is rates of HIV/AIDS actually increased over that time, because fear, sort of nebulous fear, doesn't work as an effective motivator. But what they did afterwards is they actually, they scared people, but then they showed them how to get out of it. They scared people and they showed them how to get out of it. And I said, okay, this bad thing's coming, but you can prevent it if you do X, Y, Z, step 1, step 2, step 3. So for me, I think the big takeaway from the Thai study is that fear isn't enough. We have this sort of common sense thought that, oh, this terrible disease is coming. We're going to tell people how bad it is. And that's going to be enough to scare them straight. That right. Doesn't work. Fear only works as a motivator if it's quickly followed up with some concrete instructions about how you can avoid the stimulus that you fear. So again, this is sort of a 101 introduction to some of these motivational ideas, but I hope it'll spur listeners to go dig a little deeper and think a little harder about how to motivate themselves or the people in their organization. So Jordan, it's been awesome. You've taught us so much, and it's been fascinating to hear about your research, but it wouldn't be Standard Deviations if I let you get out of here without the lightning round questions. And this one is going to, of course, be Alabama edition. So are you in?
A little nervous, but I'm down.
Yeah. So you guys can't see his background, but he's been drinking out of an Alabama mug this entire conversation, and he has a giant Alabama football helmet right behind him. So let's see if he's as true to Bama as he professes to be. So Jordan, question 1, true or false, the largest pot of baked beans ever was cooked in Alabama?
I have no idea, but I would like to say that would be something that Alabamians would pride themselves on. So I'm going to say true.
Correct. The answer is true. I looked up, I Googled fun facts about Alabama or something to try and prepare for this. And the number one thing on there was, did you know the largest pot of baked beans ever cooked was in Alabama? So put some respect on Alabama's name. Largest pot of baked beans.
I mean, that's something to be proud about.
It is.
That's something to be proud about right there.
It is. All right. So next question. Name 3 minor league mascots, minor league baseball team mascots in Alabama, which has some of the best minor league mascots around.
And this is one that I think I can get this one because I've lived in so many different parts of Alabama that we don't have any. I mean, you know all this, but we don't have any, for the listeners, we don't have any pro teams. So we pride ourselves on our minor league baseball and our college football, of course. But our hometown, formerly the Huntsville Stars, now they're known as the Trash Pandas.
Yeah,
and then
the Rocket City Trash Pandas is the formal name of the team.
Oh,
so for people who don't know, a quick digression: a trash panda is a southern slang for a raccoon. And so when we took my kids to Cape Cod a few years ago, my daughter had a little stuffed raccoon that she took around everywhere, and all these people at Cape Cod are like, "Oh, cute little girl, I love your raccoon." And she would say to them, "It's not a raccoon, it's a trash panda." And I can promise you that people at this very high-end resort in Cape Cod did not know what she was talking about. So the Rocket City,
they let the Alabamas in. They let the Alabamians come.
Yeah. So the Rocket City Trash Pandas, 1 down. What else?
So the one that I think a lot of people would know just because of Michael Jordan, but the Birmingham Barons.
Yep.
And then the third one, which I can't remember which city it is, but I know that we have a team called the Biscuits. It's either Montgomery or Mobile, but there's not many cities to choose from, but it's got to be one of those two.
It's the Montgomery Biscuits. I will allow that. Yeah. So go if you're listening to this and you're laughing right now, go look at the Montgomery Biscuits and the Rocket City Trash Pandas gear. Like, their hats are incredible. And the Biscuits, I do know, throw out biscuits at their games. So go see some AAA baseball and get biscuits thrown at you. It's a good time. Okay, so you are 2 for 2.
This is the experiences of Alabama that people need to know how living in Alabama. These follow into too many stereotypes. So
okay, well, this one's going to be impressive. This Alabama city is the former watercress capital of the world. So those weird little vegetables you find in salad and stuff sometimes. Where was that? Former watercress capital of the world.
I have no clue.
It's your hometown, bro. It's Huntsville, Alabama. Was the former watercress capital of the world. Hang your head in shame.
That's a new one. You stumped me on that one. I hope very few Huntsvillians listen to this because it's gonna be frowned upon.
Hide your helmet and your Yeti mug. So last one, we're gonna let you redeem yourself. What's the best thing about being from Alabama?
That's a good one. There's, I am as many jokes as you and I both have made on where we're from. I will say that I did appreciate my childhood in Alabama and growing up right outside of Huntsville and I thought about this is my thought is one of the things I loved so much was the fact that like money was never, and this ties into, we're both in finance. So money was never a big conversation where we grew up. It wasn't, there was never this conversation of keeping up with the Joneses or I wanted this because I saw this kid had this or this family. I don't have any memories of having, those kind of conversations with my friends or ever having those feelings. I always remember that and as I reflect back, a large spectrum of wealth, whereas, everything from the families that were on free and reduced lunch to all the way of, CEOs of the government contract or missile defense companies that are based in Huntsville, we never really had that. And so I think that was probably one of the things I'm most grateful for is everyone really got along on a different note. So it was nice. It was to not be too much humor of it, but it's to be more of a serious note. But that was something that I always was very grateful for, is that was never never a pressure.
Yeah, I've made that comment to my wife and to my parents before, that growing up in Huntsville, it was one of the least materialistic places I've ever lived. It's just fascinating. We live in Atlanta now, which is very, very showy. I think wealth is very much on display here. There's a lot of fast cars and big houses, and it's the city that's too busy to hate because everyone's working very hard to get ahead and make money. And I really did find growing up in North Alabama to be very middle class, but not very materialistic at all. And I've enjoyed that myself. So, Jordan, if people want to follow you online, where can they find you on LinkedIn or Twitter? Where can they read more about what you're up to?
Yeah, I would say the best place to find me, I'm the most active on LinkedIn. So you can find me on there. Of course, I do have a Twitter account. I interact a little bit here and there. And usually when people loop me into a conversation, I'm engaged. So feel free to reach out to me on those. And so it's my name, it's Jordan Hutchison is on LinkedIn. It's pretty searchable. And then the same with on Twitter. So I'm pretty easy to find. And then also being at XYPN, we're usually all over the place in the RIA space. So you can find me there too.
Hey, Jordan, thanks so much. Good luck as you finish out your doctoral degree. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
I appreciate it, Daniel. And thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.